Welcome. Stay a while and listen. Wait, no. Wrong game. I'm not Deckard Cain. I'm the player Xorus. I drink and I know things. Well, no, that's a more dangerous game. Anyway, welcome to the first video of my history series on the massively text-based multiplayer game GemStone III, or 4, or 2. It'll depend on what we're talking about. GemStone is very old, older than some of the people playing it. It's existed in some form since 1987. While I did have a computer in 1987, it was a Franklin and ran DOS. I'm not old enough to have been playing back then, which would have been the beta testing of GemStone II. There were no internet service providers where I lived until summer of 1995, so it wasn't possible for me to have been playing even during the ice age of GemStone III. So, just to be clear about this up front, I've only ever been a player, I've never been a GM myself. Maybe someday, not today, not yesterday. I'm more Tyrion Lannister than George R.R. Martin, the Atlas Obscura of Atlantia. I might be wrong sometimes, but I'll make it sound good. I was with a horde of unwashed masses who swarmed into GemStone when it was on AOL. Now, while a lot of people from back then have stories of getting in trouble with their parents, or spouses, or credit card companies for running up huge hourly bills, I'm not one of them. My father was using computers and routinely dealing with long-distance phone services since the 70s. It was not something that was ever going to happen, unless I figured out a password I wasn't supposed to know, which I only did once. That only cost $40. For those of you needing a mile marker for yourselves, AOL was paid by the hour until December 1st, 1996. It was after AOL went unlimited with a flat subscription rate that I first came across GemStone and Dragon Realms and so on. More specifically, it was when AOL was engaging in its infamous carpet bombing campaign, mailing out countless promotional CDs. Those things were great. You could use them as frisbees, they made decent coasters for your drinks, you could put them in the microwave. But if you put them in your computer, and most people don't know this, they would give you free time on AOL, which was its own private sandbox separate from the World Wide Web, and the rest of the web appreciated that a lot. These games didn't last long on AOL with the flat rate payment scheme. They moved to the web about half a year later. First time I was trying out GemStone was on March 22nd, 1997. It was something I made a point of remembering explicitly, as that sort of seniority used to be more of a thing. From back when I was playing Federation, that was a space adventure game that was also on AOL, and it survived a long time. It shut down only a couple of years ago. They had insurmountable technical issues, like lack of system administrator expertise and compliance with European Union data privacy laws and so on. They were British, they were incorporated in the Isle of Man, so they decided to throw in the towel. I'll talk about Federation some other time. Maybe if I make a video about Easter eggs. Federation had tons of Easter eggs and inside jokes. GemStone has some, but they're usually a lot more subtle. By the way, nice bit of trivia. If you remember the Cantina, the bar on Earth's spaceport, the staff of IB Games let Luxel make that when Federation and GemStone were both on Genie. Luxel was one of the very first players of GemStone, and if you listen to Mylax's Town Square Central podcast, which is why we have a whisper verb. I was hard-coded into Federation once to stop the game from crashing when I logged in. Something similar had to be done for her at one point early in GemStone. But back to Simultronics. The character generation process for GemStone was relatively intimidating, rolling lots of statistics, that kind of thing. You didn't understand what any of it means. A lot of people still don't know what any of it means. I remember trying to come up with names on Dragon Realms, and I kept getting pulled and held back because what I would come up with was out of genre, or so the nameless powers that be said. It had to be something appropriate for a medieval fantasy setting. So I tried to name myself Polar Kraken, and for some reason they wouldn't let me have that either. So that's about all I have to say about Dragon Realms. Screw Dragon Realms, right? With GemStone, I decided I'd be a giant man sorcerer because I could cast nasty spells and eventually become extremely powerful, or so the description of sorcerers said. But I would also be big and be able to punch things. This made sense to me at the time. People told me it was a mistake. Giant men being big and strong isn't worth having weaker casting strength. Sorcerers should be dark elves. Dark elves are the best sorcerers. But now, almost 25 years later, with so many ways to boost CS, I'm not so sure. There's something to be said for it, maybe. Of course, by far the highest level sorcerer at the end of GemStone III was a giant man, even if that was accomplished by lockpicking rather than hunting. Shows what those noobs knew in 1997. Either way, I would brawl in Icemule's Brawling Tavern, which is perfectly legal, unlike trying to kill the penguin in town, and safe, unlike trying to kill the rabbit squirrels outside the south gate. This was pretty much the coolest thing ever. When GemStone moved to the web in mid-1997, there were only a few towns: Landing, Terrace Isle, River's Rest, and Icemule, in that order. Salthaven wasn't released until around December 1998, and The Elven Nations was released throughout the second half of 2001. Winter's Landing was the original town of GemStone III, though it was called Kelfor's Landing from December 1989 until September 1995 or thereabouts, which I'll talk more about later. Something worth mentioning here: GM Kenstrom has been in charge of the landing for the past decade. He pronounces it Weinheimers. Kenstrom is horribly, horribly wrong. Most de-iced terms have similar lengthy characters as the originals and often sound like them. Wennemers doesn't. I don't know the story of how Wennemers was coined or its intended pronunciation, but we will not be calling it Weinheimers for the sake of the children. Anyway, when I was a new player in 1997, there was something odd about GemStone, something strange about its whole framework. There was almost no world setting documentation. Well, the mechanics documents, such as the spell lists, in contrast, sounded like they were excerpts from a vaster system. It was all very uneven. There was the base History of Atlantia document, which didn't have that one creation myth yet, and the Gods document, which only covered some of the gods. And that was pretty much it. Orminstra had blonde hair. Shrew still had a hyena head instead of a jackal head. There were different times, but there wasn't much to go on. Players had websites with other information on it. Some of it was archaic, some of it was made-up nonsense. Not that the mid to late 90s period is well recorded. It's pretty badly recorded, relatively speaking. What really stood out was that the places that physically existed in the game had almost nothing to do with the history document, which only provided stubs of lore for all the races available to player characters. Meanwhile, most of the places in the history document did not exist. Some of them still don't exist. In terms of the number of rooms, though, GemStone was quite large, and this was a little weird. There were some older stories for specific places, such as the Graveyard or Melgrune's Reach or Shadow Valley and the Broken Lands. But these included words that seemed to have no meaning, and they had nothing to do with the history document. Now, I'm sure many of you know why this was the case, right? Between 1989 and 1995, GemStone III was based on the Shadow World setting, licensed from Iron Crown Enterprises. This period is called the Ice Age, as a pun, since Iron Crown pulled out the license arrangement when GemStone was about to debut on AOL. Huge business opportunity. It was a deal breaker, so to speak. The GMs at the time had to totally retcon the game in a very brief amount of time, but simultaneously vastly expanded for the influx of new players. I'm told even Chris and Billing was painting rooms in Icemule. That's what it's called, room painting. Not what painting houses means in the Mafia. When I was a new player, I did not know what Ice Age meant. I assumed the North was frozen. There's a big glacier, something like that. There actually was a brief literal ice age during the transition. A meteor or something like that fell from the sky. Luxel thinks it was the fifth moon, which was called Varan, since Atlantia only has 4 moons. I honestly don't know. It was a little bit later, when I was hungry for world development understanding, that I figured it all out. When GemStone was on Genie, the General Electric network service, there was a file library called the Tombs of Colthea. Much as the lore documents on the Play.net website are listed under the heading Tombs of Atlantia, that's what the Tombs of Colthea were. The vast majority of the articles in the Tombs of Colthea were excerpts from the Shadow World Master Atlas 1st edition and the Kelborn Adventure module from 1989. Shadow World is a completely different world setting, with a different historical timeline, and the world was called Calthea rather than Atlantia. The Darkstone Bay region, originally called Cladesburn Bay, is adapted from the Kelborn source book. Kelfor's Landing comes from it. There's a map of the town and everything. But some stories, such as the backstory of the Broken Lands or Shadow Valley or Melgrim's Reach, were made by staff of Civitronics and only existed in GemStone. They were written in the mostly forgotten context of the Shadow World history and world setting. There was a lot of implicit or tacit lore, such as for the creatures, which came from the Rolemaster books. Shadow World is a campaign setting, Rolemaster is a game system, like Forgotten Realms versus Dungeons and Dragons. But there's one story that has always stood out to me from the rest as the greatest mystery: the legend of the necropolis of Etrivion, the backstory of the graveyard. The graveyard is one of the very oldest parts of GemStone. It's over 30 years old. I asked Luxelle once if she remembered if it was released in early 1990 or late 1989, and she said something like, "Gosh, wasn't it always there?" I asked Asterisk once, who played in 1990, and he said if we were out hunting, it was either right outside town or it was in the graveyard. Which isn't to say the graveyard was released all at once. The creatures were released gradually throughout 1990, and some of the original creatures are gone now. But there is nothing in GemStone that is so iconic, so impressionable on the new player as the graveyard, and having to get past that huge gate with the crypt and the burial mound. What stands out about the graveyard is its imagery, its symbolism. This is a place with details, and there seems to be a concept. In the legend of the necropolis of Etrivion, it says Bander Etrivion completed it according to his grand design, quote unquote. And that becomes the question: what is the grand design of the graveyard? When I was first trying to figure this out, I found myself getting confused. Some parts of the graveyard were clearly meaningful, other parts appeared meaningless, or even did not seem consistent. With a little reflection, I was able to realize that the meaningful parts were all from around 1990, and that to make sense of it, you have to pretend the parts of it that were added later don't exist. That sounds obvious when you actually say it, but you have to come to that realization first. Those include the Hall of the Dead and Minions' quarters behind the sarcophagus in the crypt, which was related to a 1996 storyline about the suspiciously well-to-do town undertaker, Serenity, being involved in a grave robbing operation, as well as the expansion to the burial mound up through the albino tomb spiders, and Slither Creek and Wormwood Slough, and the burial grounds to the east of the crypt. Those were all added later and are unrelated to the fundamental concept. Shadow Valley was also several years later, partly in the Ice Age, partly after it, but it is a much more complex subject. It has to be dealt with separately. Keeping with the original parts, the forest and gate, crypt, ghoul tunnels, burial mound, bog, and the deep underground, everything is meaningful and related to the backstory for the graveyard. Much of this has implicit meaning that is immediately informed by I.C.E. source books. You might call this paleo history. It's conservative and not controversial, or shouldn't be, but even then some of it still doesn't make sense because the story itself is off canon. There seems to be more going on at a level of subtext rather than context, and in later videos I will call this crypto history. It's something that can only be speculated at by constructing theories, and I'll be very clear when I'm speculating in that way. Here's the rub: there's a lot of Rolemaster material and a lot of Shadow World books. The vast majority of it has nothing to do with GemStone. Even some of the things which should be relevant in terms of internal logical consistency may not actually be relevant. Moreover, GemStone III was its own instance. It was not absolutely bound to the source books. There are things that only existed in GemStone. There are things that would only have been true in GemStone. Even more subtle is that the graveyard is so old, you have to be careful to not use any I.C.E. books that were published later than 1989. And that includes significant expansions of that world setting that were first published later in 1990. Among these are most of the Dark Gods, whose pantheon did not exist until the 1990 books, and were not included in the Tombs of Calthea until one of the Broken Lands documents mentioned them. Not only is there a steep learning curve on the archaic world setting, then there's also the need to partition that setting into contemporary time horizons. Otherwise, you'll be accidentally reading anachronism into things. So in this first series of videos, we will be exploring the original parts of the graveyard, restoring its context. I will explain all of the relevant parts from the Shadow World setting and highlighting where the story goes off canon for Shadow World. Then I will construct a theory about its grand design, which, as you will see, is an interpretation of the graveyard in terms of allegory, or parallel for certain pieces of real-world literature and mythology. Whether this is right or wrong, I cannot say, but it will be a convincing argument. Thank you for listening through this first installment in the Graveyard Exploration series. Hopefully, I will make the subject accessible in the future videos.